Hello, everyone, and welcome to the discussion of panel 20 of this year's George Rudé seminar, the theme of which is Trans-imperial and Trans-colonial connections. I'm in Sydney on a chilly winter's night. One of our panelists is in a rather brighter summer day in Paris, and others of you will be listening in various other countries. I hope you're all healthy and coping with the coronavirus. And I'd like to thank the conveners of the Rudé seminar for making it possible for us to meet and to have our sessions despite the inability to travel and the other problems associated with the current circumstances. In this panel, we have had 3 presentations by researchers from different countries, and I'd like to begin by introducing them very briefly in alphabetical order. Dr. Charlotte Legg studied at the University of Southampton and at New York University. She's currently head of the Department of French International Politics and History at the University of London Institute in Paris. And she has in press a book from the University of Nebraska Press entitled The New White Race, Settler Colonialism and the Press in French Algeria. Secondly, Dr. Briony Neilson, who studied at the University of New South Wales and the University of Sydney, and who is a sessional academic in the Department of History at the University of Sydney. She's also affiliated with the CNRS lab Centre pour les Humanités Numériques et l'Histoire de la Justice in Paris. She's published widely on the history of crime and punishment and criminal justice in 19th century France, particularly on the history of juvenile justice reform, and also on the histories of British and French convict transportation and penal colonialism in Oceania. As well, she is the editor of the Rudé Society's French History and Civilization periodical. And our third speaker, Keith Rathbone, who teaches at Macquarie University here in Sydney. He has a PhD from Northwestern University, and he researches 20th century French social and cultural history. His research addresses issues such as the continuity between the Third Republic and the Vichy regime, the gendered ideology of the Vichy sports program, and the development of collaboration and resistance. Many of you who are listening will, I hope, have had the chance to hear the 3 excellent papers given by our speakers, which touch on a variety of issues from sport to psychology and philosophy, to convict transportation and heritage, and the links between France and Australia and New Zealand, as well as the French territory of New Caledonia. I'd like to begin simply by asking each of them to give us a bit of a summary or a comment on their own papers, just for a couple of minutes to refresh our memories. And perhaps we could begin with Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Robert. Hello, everybody. Yeah, absolutely. So Robert, you kindly mentioned my forthcoming book on the press and settler colonialism in Algeria. And this paper that I've presented for this conference grows out of an observation that I made doing the research for that book, where I found settler journalists in Algeria became very interested at the end of the 19th century in what was going on in British settler colonies, and particularly thinking how they might take some of those colonies as models for their own progress. So really this paper that I presented is a first foray into a new research project looking more broadly at French perspectives on settler colonialism across the British Empire, and trying to think about how different actors within imperial space, both French and British and indigenous, interacted to create, to construct and to contest discourses of race particularly, and also gender. So this paper looks at one particular actor, the anarchist Paul Robin, and his journey to New Zealand in 1898 and 1899, and tries to think about how that voyage influenced his own thoughts, and how particularly his thoughts on the perceived need for racial regeneration, the creation of a discourse of whiteness that was inter-imperial rather than simply national.
Thank you. Perhaps Briony next.
Thank you so much, Robert. Lovely to see you, Charlotte and Keith. I'm glad we can be together even though we're not together. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in Australia. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to just take a few seconds to thank David Smith so much, and everyone at H France, for all they've done in bringing this virtual conference together. And also I'd like to thank the New Zealand conference organisers, Kirsty Carpenter, Tracy Adams and Joe Zizek, for all the time and effort that they've put into organising this and bringing us together in this very strange period, which hopefully at some time we will be looking back on and not just living through. So to give a sort of summary, I guess, of my paper, I look at some of the dynamics in the preservation of the heritage sites of the Ban in New Caledonia, particularly in terms of how it pertains to New Caledonia's relationship with neighbouring Australia. And it's part of a bigger project where I've been looking at the entangled histories of Australia and New Caledonia as European settler colonies with convict pasts, with a particular view to shedding light on how ideas, practices and memory politics about penal colonialism in these two places were formed out of their conversation or out of their dialectical relationship. So essentially in the paper, I look at some of the efforts that have been made primarily in New Caledonia to preserve penal heritage since the 1970s, and I offer a few thoughts on Australia's role in shaping how that past has been engaged with, and we might say mobilised. I should say perhaps that I framed the project in that paper. I framed it primarily as histoire croisée or entangled history, but my paper, as you may have noticed, can also be categorised as comparative history. So I've sought to show some of the differences and similarities between Australia and New Caledonia in terms of engaging with the convict past and penal heritage. And all of this is positioned within the frame of settler colonialism. So I could elaborate on what I talk about in the paper, but perhaps there's no need. We've all heard it, and I'm sure we can have a discussion about it. But yeah, I'll leave it at that, and we can open up the discussion later. Thanks.
Thanks, Briony. And now Keith.
Hi, I'd like to second Briony and Charlotte's thank yous to everyone at H France and at the Rudé and at Society for French Historical Studies. This project for me is a very much in its early stages. And I don't really know what it's going to be, except maybe hopefully an article, maybe it will go on later. For those of you who know a little bit about my research, I'm really interested in the ways in which French political regimes have used sports to promote certain policies, and the ways in which people have accepted, rejected, contested, changed those policies. So looking primarily at the Popular Front and then at the Vichy regime. But I have a sideline as a podcaster with the New Books and Sports podcast. And so if you, I don't know, just before we had to organize this panel, I read a book about First Nations lacrosse, and discovered that a First Nations lacrosse team had come to France in the 1860s. And I wanted to know more about that. And I found that I couldn't discover very much, but it led me down these strange rabbit holes to learning more about indigenous sports within French history. And I had noticed there was a certain amount of interest in the Maori All Blacks. And I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to explore just a crazy topic for myself since moving to the antipodes. So for me, this is opportunity to think more about indigeneity, but also a little bit of an opportunity to explore some personal interests now that I've moved from the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere, and to learn more about the particular histories of indigenous peoples in Australia and New Zealand. So I'm hopeful that this will move forward and become a broader look at the movement of some Australian indigenous as well as Maori sportsmen into Europe, into both London and Paris.
Thank you. I think it's always really interesting to hear how people come to their projects and also where their projects are going to end up in books or articles or further researches. Students, I find, often wonder how we get to our topics, and therefore it's enlightening to know how people do find them by luck, happenstance, or intention. I wonder if the three of you have questions that you would like to ask of each other, or comments you would like to make on each other's research.
I certainly do. How shall we do this? Shall we go alphabetically and start with Charlotte? Sorry, Charlotte. Do you mind? Do you mind? I really enjoyed your paper. I think this question of Paul Robin's engagement with the foreign settler colonial community and how that fed into his own experiments back in Europe is a really rich one. And I have to say, I also really enjoyed the description of Professor Bickerton's experimental community at Wainoni as a kind of Eden with a garden overlooking the river filled with ferns and fruit trees, and yet everything signals to industry, you know, so nature is absolutely being harnessed. And I love the taxidermy penguins. We have to know more about the taxidermy penguins. But the thing that I was sort of interested in knowing, I've got various questions, but I'll just start with this one, is knowing more about the particular sort of geographical frame of reference that Robin was interpreting New Zealand through in terms of settler colonial systems. And I have to confess that I'm betraying my own personal interest here to a certain extent. You know, I'm going to be talking about New Caledonia, but I'll get there in a second. You note that Algeria was the main point of comparison for the French in terms of settler colonialism and in terms of their projects, but I couldn't help wondering about the place of France's other settler colony at this time, much smaller one, admittedly, but much closer geographically and culturally to New Zealand. So, you know, New Caledonia at this time that Robin's in New Zealand, so he's there in 1898, 1899. In 1897, New Caledonia has just abandoned, theoretically only suspended, but it's abandoned convict transportation, and it's embarked as on a path to sort of free settler colonialism. So I wondered whether Robin or any of the commentators you discussed in your paper had anything to say about New Caledonia, particularly in comparison to New Zealand. And then I'm also interested in whether Robin himself had any reflections on people like Louise Michel, a fellow anarchist who had spent time in New Caledonia. So perhaps it's a little unfair to be saying, tell me about another place, but I'm sort of interested in how he is positioning New Zealand within the South Pacific, the French South Pacific, because it is much more proximate.
Thank you so much, Briony. It's a really great question, and I just think it's wonderful that we get this opportunity to, you know, have these questions and feedback on our papers, which is, you know, one of the wonderful things about doing a conference. So it's great that it happens in this format too. So Paul Robin himself. Sorry, I think I'm creating an echo. I'll just see if I can turn myself down. Paul Robin himself doesn't actually. I haven't found as yet any specific mention of New Caledonia. I get the sense that his approach to New Zealand and to the South Pacific in general is a very kind of impressionistic, you know, this is a dreamlike space, it's the other side of the world, it's, you know, a kind of voyage of discovery, and you know, he, for all his talk of, you know, the integral man and trying to combine practical realities with theory, I don't get the sense that he has a very clear grasp on the realities of the situation. He sort of seems very idealistic in temperament, and certainly in terms of his voyage to New Zealand. So he doesn't mention New Caledonia, but of course other people I sort of mentioned briefly in the paper did, and they also talk about Australia and the colonies there, and of course Métain and Siegfried, about whom Robert has written as well, made a voyage between Australia and New Zealand to look for, made several voyages to look for, you know, evidence of social change and how that might or might not apply in the French context. But in terms of New Caledonia specifically, I think I used part of a quote from Richard Waddington, and that was in he made that quote in the context of a debate in the French Parliament, where he's sort of saying, "Oh, if only we had, you know, New Zealand, if only it wasn't British, if only it belonged to us." And actually, I didn't include the end of that quote, but he goes on to say, "But I guess we can't maudire our own colonies. We'll have to sort of, you know, make do with what we've got." And it seems to be that the approach, at least of French politicians at the time, is very much well, we've got New Caledonia, I guess we'll have to make something of it. And it seems very, yeah, that there's regret expressed that New Caledonia isn't something else, but there's a sort of a willingness to sort of see what they can make of it. So yeah, I guess all of their perspectives are being made in comparison, either explicit or implicit, to other imperial spaces as well, definitely. But the penguins, I can tell you, you know, I can also tell you more about. It was a detail in in Paul Robin's writings, but he does get quite carried away about, you know, talking about these penguins and then talking about a large, long photo that also shows the penguins before they were in taxidermy form. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret all that yet, but, you know, we'll get there in the end.
Thank you, both of you. Keith has a question now.
Yeah, I don't know if we're raising our hands. It's going to be in the video now, I guess. I love the paper, Charlotte, and I noticed there were some parallels between our two work in unexpected ways, especially in this kind of French missed opportunity. Oh, that if only we'd had New Zealand. I do wonder if you're getting a lot, especially since Robin's a neo-Malthusian, if there's a lot of discussion about this kind of fatal impact, and what is Robin's take on the Maori people that must have been around when he's there. So maybe you can talk to us about that some.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Keith. It's very much a case of an absence of presence in his writings. So when he is in New Zealand, he gives several interviews and writes several articles in local newspapers, around, mostly newspapers published around Christchurch. And he, at no point does he sort of make any reference at all to indigenous people or to Maori. And then in his sort of spectacular newspaper that he launches when he returns to Europe, La Tribu, there's no explicit reference of indigenous peoples of any kind. And it's sort of, in some ways, it posed a kind of a methodological problem for me, and a question for myself about my own argument. But I really think it needs to. I interpret this absence of presence as a sort of this mythology of the vanishing native. In we look at, you know, North American settler colonial discourse as well, And it seems that there's this, again, it's his very impressionistic understanding of other peoples and other cultures that he's not engaging with directly or trying to understand, properly, but is sort of just bringing the kind of fantastical elements and the reference points into his own discourse. So I think that he, in many ways, he goes to the other side of the world and learns nothing, but carries on these fantastical discourses that can be read in the French press of the era. In any case, so although he was sort of exceptional in many ways, I think in terms of racial discourse, he was just very much a man of his time, and didn't connect other elements of social progress to that question of racial hierarchies in empire.
Can I build off that question and ask another question of Charlotte? Is that okay? I don't know what the rules are here. I'm going to make the rules.
Yes, but then I have to ask you guys some questions because I've got some.
That's so related to Keith's question just now. I was very struck, and you made this point yourself, really, that you had the nice line where you talk about how New Zealand was a projection of what France could have been if the revolution had taken a different course, social reform without revolutionary violence. And this issue of the violence is so, it's the elephant in the room. I wonder whether he ever talks about the violence against the Maori, or or their own warring, or whether he has anything to say about violence in New Zealand.
Yeah, no. From what I've found of Paul Robin's writing, he doesn't mention it at all, and I think it adds. It's the discourse of the vanishing native and the sort of effacing of settler colonial violence that goes hand in hand. Other commentators like Metin or Siegfried basically sort of they apply the same discourses but in a different way. They talk about how they say, well, the Maori never actually really adapted, acclimatized to the land and the climate of New Zealand. So there's the sense of the inevitability of their decline legitimizes and indigenizes the settlers and creates. I think it's also fascinating that I think it's Siegfried talks about New Zealand as a white man's country. He's writing in French, but slips into English for those particular terms, and I just think that kind of it's not really code switching, but that kind of linguistic exchange also is indicative of the way these discourses are constructed inter-imperially as well. But perhaps this is my opportunity to ask some questions of you. Would that be okay, Robert, do you think?
Please go ahead. You've been in the firing line for a few minutes now.
Yeah, this is just a way of stepping out of the spotlight. But I guess if we carry on alphabetically, Briony, it's your turn. Thank you so much for your incredible, amazing, wonderful paper. I just really, really enjoyed it, and I think as I've noticed in other work you've done, just the incredible sensibility to the emotional dynamics of the settler colonial situation that I thought was really great. I have a whole bunch of questions. I guess I could start with this one. I was wondering, you described this very particular example of the preservation of the Bany as heritage sites, but I was wondering, is that campaign for Caldoche heritage more widespread, and how much of the population does it touch? I guess I'm thinking of a kind of, again, Algerian comparison in terms of, I know in the Algerian sort of nostalgia case, there's very much a generational dimension to campaigns for heritage or recognition. And you mentioned that there are geographical disparities in terms of campaigns, but I just wondered, is there also this generational dimension? How much of the Caldoche population is really invested in this kind of discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you for the generous comments. The geographical consideration, I think I covered pretty much, in the paper itself. So it's very, from what I understand from the sources that I've been able to read so far, and I think we're all in the same boat, that world events have got in the way of some of the research that we would have otherwise done. But nevertheless, I would be surprised if there was ever any evidence of this phenomenon extending, very far north into New Caledonia, where European presence is much weaker. It is very localized around the south. The question of the generational, whether it's a generational campaign, that's a very perceptive question, because many of these organisations that pop up in the 1970s are sort of struggling to find members in the 1990s, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of them have now folded. So it really was this sort of wave at a time when it was actually a French state policy to encourage migration to New Caledonia off the back of a big nickel boom at the end of the 60s, early 70s. I mean, this all overlaps with Kanak struggles for self-determination as well. But there's a concerted effort by the French state to boost the numbers of French settlers, and there's also a sort of proliferation of these local groups, not all of them historical, but sort of community groups. And so by the 1980s and 1990s, they're starting to sort of fall away, because they're largely based on the sort of charismatic personalities of the people involved, and the younger people are just less interested in being part of them. So when eventually we can fly again and I can go to New Caledonia and conduct the oral history research that I intend to do, and meet with people and sort of talk about this sort of stuff, it'll be interesting to see how younger people these days relate to these sites at a time when there's a lot more investment in them and they're becoming much more prominent.
And I think Keith has a question now.
Yeah, I want to build on that, because one thing I found fascinating, I found the whole paper fascinating, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But I noted at one point in time you discussed Australian and New Caledonian interest in convict heritage emerging simultaneously, and I wondered what might be going on there, because at the risk of insulting the Australians on the panel, since having moved here, I've discovered that there's conflicting opinions about whether you can ask people if they have convict heritage, what that means. Some people think it's good, some people think it's bad or complicated. So I'm wondering if you can we see these two things emerging at the same time. Is it coincidence? Are they entangled? And if they are they now unraveling in different ways? Or
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I mean, this is, again, something that I think has a richness that I intend to pursue further. But in terms of kind of the existing knowledge that we have of engagement with the convict past, from about the late 1950s into the 1960s in Australia, there's a kind of a building positive engagement with the convict past in terms of a kind of proud Australian nationalism directed against the British. So there are a few kind of key Australian history texts that are now looked on with a certain amount of circumspection, but at the time they sort of changed the paradigm and made Australians feel more proud about their own distinct past, and had a sense of the difference between Australian culture to the British metropole. It was a culture of its own. So in the 1960s, 1970s, people are starting to break that taboo of not talking about the convict past. And it's interesting that you think that there's still perhaps a reluctance to talk about it, because as far as I can see, either people don't care about it or they're proud of it. So, to have a convict ancestor is a badge of pride, or, people couldn't care less. But before about the 1960s, it was very much something that people would not talk about. in terms of why it is that in New Caledonia and Australia this is happening pretty much simultaneously, I actually started looking into this in greater depth to try to understand whether in Australia there's a similar kind of search to combat Aboriginal claims for self-determination in this period. I found there's no research on this. So this is actually what I want to kind of pursue, again, you know, probably in a more comparative way. But it's fascinating, the idea that, you know, the same terms that Aboriginal people are using to assert their rights to self-determination and sovereignty are mimicked in a kind of, in a way, by settlers, you know, seeking a sort of sense of belonging and attachment to place. So yeah, it's something, it's a path that I need to explore more.
Thank you all. And to ensure parité, perhaps questions for Keith now.
I'll jump in with a question if Briony doesn't mind, if that's all right. Yeah, thank you so much, Keith. I really, really enjoyed your paper. I mean, it raised so many questions about, particularly, yeah, the interrelationship of racial discourses and gender discourses and kind of models of masculinity that were competing. I think I also have a question about the Black utopia that the Compagnie Polynesienne wanted to create, but that's a kind of a side. That was just a line in the paper, so I have a bigger question about the paper itself. But if you can tell me about that, I'd love that. Yeah, so you mentioned that the French press used the occasion of these rugby tours to criticize the kind of British imperial style as being overly violent. But I just wondered do they formulate this critique sort of consciously in a way that somehow still salvages sort of whiteness as a more transnational category, or do they just go all out in their critique?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, and caveats that I'm looking mostly at the sports pages, so deep intellectual conversation is often lacking. But no, that for them, this is a critique of British imperialism. Even if you can read in the next column a complementary piece that talks about the ways in which British imperialism has built British masculinity and its superiority to kind of French notions of masculinity. So throughout the beginning of the 20th century, but especially during the interwar period, there's a significant amount of comparison, negative, often very negative comparison of French sports journalists comparing French athletes to British athletes, but often paralleling this kind of this critique of British imperialism as being particularly violent, abstracted from any real realities of the colonial situation in different places. But this was, I think, particularly strong in the case of New Zealand because this fatal impact idea, the idea that the Maori were just about to be completely wiped out and be totally gone, or discussions of indigenous peoples in Australia, around similar Australian, a tour of an Australian indigenous cricket team. This discussion about indigenous Australians being totally gone is suffused with this idea that British colonialism is maybe particularly bad. So I haven't done enough work with it yet, and I'm trying to pull out some of these ideas, but I'm not seeing a kind of a transnational whiteness that I would have expected to find, because I think in sports it's all about building the nation state. And for many of these people, it's very much about the French race.
Thank you.
Sorry, Robert. I was just going to rudely leap in and interrogate Keith further. I really enjoyed your paper too, like Charlotte. And I thought it worked really well looking at those two tours side by side, and very strikingly different reception that they got. And this is a minor question, but I was curious as to why the French were so convinced that they were going to beat the all Maori team. On what basis did they expect to win? I mean, the Maori team won 14 out of 15, so it wasn't quite the Invincibles, but you know, they still did very well. But that's not my question. If you want to answer that would be great. But my question was, I've got a few, but one that I thought was something that you referred to at a couple of points, and I just would like to know more, is that you mentioned that the French drew mostly technical lessons from the Maori players, and they didn't draw epistemological, or they didn't grasp the underlying epistemological lessons or ideas of their games. I'm curious to know what those, because I'm not drawing them either. I would like to know what the epistemological underpinnings are. So if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think actually those questions work together really nicely, because for the Maori, the whole reason the tour is actually formed is because there's a religious movement, the Rantana movement that's going on in New Zealand at the time, that's an outgrowth of a Maori nationalist movement, and this is going to lead up to the Treaty of Waitangi, and they put pressure on the rugby union in New Zealand. They basically say, hey, you guys went to Europe, you got all this money, you came back, but none of it came back into our communities, and we want to have access to some of this money. And so they were threatening to basically boycott the rugby union and have an all Maori rugby federation. And so the rugby union caves, and they go, okay, well, you guys can go to Europe too, and we'll take the money that you bring back and we'll infuse that into mostly Maori communities. And so it's initially very much part of this push towards Waitangi, push towards what will eventually become nested sovereignties, but this assertion of a strong Maori nation as separate and distinct from New Zealand and the Pakai nation, right? The French don't get that at all. They just, for them, this is just a tour of indigenous athletes that's viewed as a kind of colonial menagerie, rather than with separate group of people articulating a separate sovereignty. So they're not picking that up at all. Maybe just Geo, I have that weird, he has that one weird article where he kind of gets at the sense that the Maori are this distinct people, but he even puts it in this melancholic frame where it feels like they're going to be dying off. The French didn't really understand that, and the lessons they draw are largely technical, and I think that they're drawing it based, they have these kind of racist underpinnings, and it goes back to them thinking about sport in racial contexts in other places like they did in their own colonies, where of course French people would beat Africans in soccer because, you know, while they might be physically talented, they don't have the, you know, sophistication, the real sophistication to play the game right. They don't know how to space, they don't know how to do this, do that. So the French press was viewing this through this lens, and I think that maybe some more knowledgeable people understood that actually the Maori were very talented ruggers and were going to do quite well, and they did, and in some ways maybe even better than the Invincibles, because they played so many more games in a much more compressed time frame. So the 87-0 first win was probably a good indicator that they were going to do well in France.
Thank you so much to all of you. We're probably moving towards the end of our allotted time, but I'd like to ask a question of all three of you. And it's a question that's easy to ask, although perhaps harder to answer. What do you think your research and your particular theme is bringing to the historiography of France, or for that matter, to the historiography of New Caledonia, to Australia, and to New Zealand? Maybe even to the methodology of looking at those entangled histories.
Should we all go at once, or?
Well, I think let's be perverse and start in reverse alphabetical order. So Keith.
Okay, yeah. In some ways, I actually came to this paper not as a French historian, but as a sports historian. I often straddle those different historiographies, and so one of the things that's more emergent in sports history over the last decade is the idea that sports didn't only move along imperial lines, but that there are these strange entanglements. And so I wondered what, looking at a bunch of Kiwis who had gone these 2 tours, one the All Blacks, one the Maori All Blacks, to France, could tell us about the movement of ideas about sports. And once I'd started to look into it, it was, I realized, sorry, I'm about to give a 2-year-old visit here. I realized it was not about what I thought it was. And so I'm losing my train of thought. But yeah, so for me, I came at it as a sports historian. So I wanted to make a comment in sports historiography, but I'm thinking now that it might speak more broadly to both fields.
No.
Thank you. Briony.
Yeah, it's a big question, Robert, which I will not do justice to, but I can sort of touch on some things. I mean, to me, speaking more broadly, my research into New Caledonia and Australia, I think, is suggesting ways of understanding settler colonialism in a kind of broader frame. So hopefully, and not in terms of a comparison. So I in my paper, I talk about Claire Anderson's, research, not just hers, but the research that she has sort of spearheaded into global history of coerced migration and so on. And I think what I hope my work is doing is sort of suggesting that penal colonialism, settler colonialism is something that is very dynamic, and the parties that are involved are contributing to, the fashioning of settler colonialism in the process of it being acted out. And I hope also that I'm sort of unsettling some of those more familiar frames. Australian history is still very, very much seen in terms of, the British Empire or its relationship with particular other places, and it's just extraordinary how little consideration there's given to Australia's place still in the Pacific. I mean, Robert, your work many years ago made a similar point, and when I read it, I sort of think your work has a resonance today that is quite extraordinary. And Isabel Merle talks about similar things in her work about New Caledonia. So I feel like the history of New Caledonia is something that, for whatever reason, scholars don't want to engage with, or don't want to engage with it en masse. So it's sort of left out. And yet Isabel Merle's work showed that, it's almost the most exemplary demonstration of French settler colonialism. The violence in New Caledonia exemplifies the violence of French colonialism generally. So I guess I'm also trying to reinstate New Caledonia into French history. Just a minor thing like that.
Thank you. And Charlotte.
It is a big question, but it's good to keep having it asked of me and to make myself ask it of myself as often as possible. I think, obviously I've been working on Algeria specifically for a long time, and I think I wanted, in some ways, although I do think of myself as a historian of France, I think of myself as a historian of empire, and so I wanted to sort of interrogate the notion of empire more broadly through looking, like Briony, trying to look at connections as well as comparisons across empires, and just to contribute really to this this ongoing project in the historiography to think about empire beyond a national frame, which has been important for many years now, but I think you know, we're still thinking about differences between connections and comparisons. So that's something that I want to do better as I move forward. And I think just along the way, having stumbled upon Paul Robin as a case study, hopefully I've also found a way of thinking about what's been termed, you know, French neo-Malthusianism, or sort of French concerns about gender and degeneration at the end of the 19th century, also going beyond the national framework for that, because obviously, you know, discourses of race and gender are so fundamentally interarticulated. And as a methodological contribution, I don't know if I will achieve this, but I want to get to a place where I can make some kind of claim to looking at a way of doing it, a kind of cultural history of international relations that involves states, but also non-state actors. So that, I mean, I think the history of international relations is obviously fascinating and a really sort of developing field at the moment, but it's perhaps not particularly culturally, it's not coming from a cultural history dimension most of the time. So that's something I'm interested in becoming more involved in, but it's going to be a long path. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to all of you. I think your topics are all so rich that we would undoubtedly be able to discuss much longer. What strikes me is not only the richness of your materials, your research, and your interpretations, but also the way that you imply and underline how France was important to Australia and New Zealand, a connection that we sometimes ignore, as Briony said, in this part of the world, but also how, even though they were far away, Australia and New Zealand had a certain relevance and a certain presence in France. Again, something that is not always realized. And in some ways, the research that has been done by all of you shows those connections between the two hemispheres, between Europe and the Antipodes. And I think it also shows the way that France looks a little bit different when seen from a vantage point of Australasia than it looks from the position of other European countries or North America. And that provides us perhaps a different perspective on our own histories and on the history of France and on global history in general. So thank you all very much for your presentations and for your discussion this evening. And I hope we can all meet up and share a glass of wine for real in the near future. And until then, au revoir.